On a quiet Monday morning at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the usual rhythm of the legal system seemed different. The corridors were filled with murmurs, not from the chatter of routine cases, but from a trial that had captured the city's attention. At the center of it stood Jessica Taylor, a police officer known not for her service, but for her unshakable arrogance. She was no stranger to controversy, shielded by the authority of her badge in the past. But today, she faced charges that had struck a nerve far beyond the courtroom walls. Reckless driving, disregard for safety, and a near miss that left 68-year-old Carlos Martinez injured and humiliated. But this wasn't just another case of misconduct swept under the rug. This time, the stakes were different. Jessica Taylor wasn't just on trial for her actions. She was about to face a man who had built his career on fairness and integrity, Judge Samuel Hayes. A man who believed in one thing above all: the law sees no rank, no privilege, and no arrogance. Inside the courtroom, the tension was undeniable. People weren't there for a simple verdict. They were there to witness a reckoning. Would justice hold firm against entitlement? Would accountability prevail over defiance? In the next few hours, one officer's actions would test the limits of justice, and one judge's resolve would remind everyone of a simple truth: no one is above the law. The courtroom doors creaked open, and in walked Jessica Taylor. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her polished shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor with every step. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent a career above scrutiny. Head held high, she scanned the room, her gaze cold and calculating, as if daring anyone to question her. The whispers began almost immediately. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, exchanging glances that carried the weight of unspoken judgments. Spectators leaned toward one another, their voices barely audible but filled with disdain. At the defendant's table, Jessica's lawyer leaned in close, speaking urgently, likely a reminder to temper her arrogance. But Jessica barely acknowledged him, her lips curling into a faint smirk. To her, this wasn't a trial. It was a formality, a stage where she was a star. The murmurs quieted as the side door opened, and Judge Samuel Hayes entered. His presence was commanding without effort. He moved deliberately, his expression calm but firm, a man who had no tolerance for disrespect in his courtroom. The bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise." The room obeyed in unison, except for Jessica. She rose reluctantly, her audible sigh cutting through the silence like a challenge. Judge Hayes's sharp gaze flickered toward her, but he said nothing. His authority didn't need words. It was clear that this was his courtroom, and the proceedings would go his way. The room fell silent as Judge Hayes adjusted his glasses and opened the case file. His voice was calm, but each word was deliberate, commanding the attention of everyone present. He outlined the charges against Jessica: reckless driving, running a red light, and nearly causing a serious accident that left Carlos Martinez injured. The seriousness of the accusations hung heavy in the air. Jessica, however, appeared unmoved. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and let out a quiet chuckle. When Judge Hayes paused, she spoke dismissively: "It's being blown out of proportion. I didn't hit him, and he's fine." Her words rippled through the courtroom, drawing sharp glances and whispered indignation from the audience. To many, her lack of remorse was as shocking as the incident itself. Then, Judge Hayes called for Carlos Martinez to enter. The rear doors opened slowly, and all eyes turned as the elderly man stepped forward. Thin, frail, and moving with difficulty, Carlos approached the front of the courtroom. His right arm was in a sling, a visible reminder of the injury he had sustained. The weight of his presence was undeniable. The whispers stopped. The room grew still, as if the air itself carried the gravity of what was unfolding. Jessica's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. She sat upright, her gaze darting toward Carlos. But it wasn't guilt that crossed her face, only irritation, as though his very presence was an inconvenience. Carlos stood quietly before the judge, his eyes downcast, his pain written on every line of his face. For the first time, the human cost of Jessica's actions was impossible to ignore. Judge Hayes leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Taylor, this is a man you nearly hit. Look at him." Jessica glanced at Carlos briefly, then shrugged, her voice dripping with indifference. "I didn't hit him. People are just overreacting." Carlos Martinez stood at the front of the courtroom, his frail figure a stark contrast to the imposing presence of the defendant. His right arm rested in a sling, a reminder of the pain and disruption caused by the reckless actions of Jessica Taylor. He didn't need to speak. His quiet dignity said enough. The room watched him, the weight of his suffering now impossible to ignore, except, it seemed, by Jessica. Jessica's gaze rested on Carlos for a brief moment, then shifted away, her expression indifferent. When she finally spoke, her words shocked the courtroom. "If he hadn't stepped into the street so carelessly, none of this would have happened," she said, her tone laced with blame. Jessica shifted in her seat, but her smirk remained, as if she were immune to accountability. Yet the energy in the room had shifted. The weight of Judge Hayes' rebuke lingered, challenging her defiance. Judge Hayes set his pen down and removed his glasses, his gaze unwavering as he addressed Jessica directly. "Ms. Taylor, do you believe that the badge you wear absolves you of responsibility? That it grants you the privilege to act recklessly without consequence?" His words hung heavy in the air. Jessica's response was slow, calculated. "I did what anyone would have done," she said, her voice firm. But there was a crack, a hesitation, barely perceptible. The courtroom caught it, and so did Judge Hayes. "You did what anyone would have done," he repeated, his tone sharper now. "Anyone else would have slowed down. Anyone else would have valued the life of a man crossing the street. But you, Officer Taylor, chose arrogance over accountability." Jessica's confidence faltered, her posture stiffened, and for the first time, she avoided meeting the judge's gaze. Her armor of defiance seemed thinner now, unable to shield her from the gravity of his words. Judge Hayes continued, his voice rising slightly, commanding the room. "This court isn't here to protect your pride or your rank. It's here to uphold justice. For Mr. Martinez, for this community, and for the principles you swore to protect. What you've shown today is not just negligence. It's a betrayal of the trust placed in you as an officer of the law." The room was silent. Jessica's smirk was gone, replaced